Hello, and welcome to the Book Podcast, where we talk about books. The Book Podcast is proud to be sponsored by fakewebsite.com, where nothing happens. Thank you for listening to the Book Podcast. Well, this one night, out by the river, I wasn't very brave. What were the psychological issues shown and addressed in Tim O'Brien's novel, The Things They Carried, in the chapter Speaking of Courage and Notes?
Hi, I'm Jude, and I was with Jimmy the night Norman Bowker drove around the lake. Everyone in town knew Norman. He was a good man. Quiet,
Introduce yourself and say how you know Norman Bowker.
Hi, my name's Jimmy. I was 15 years old at the time. I heard about him through the newspaper. He hung himself. I remember one night he was driving around the lake. He probably passed by me about 6 or 7 times. He honked the horn at my friend Jude and me a few times.
Norman Bowker was my friend. We were in Vietnam together. He sent me a letter in 1975 that encouraged me to write Speaking of Courage. He discussed his mental issues and his obvious problems adjusting to the outside world after the war.
What aspects of Norman Bowker's letter inspired you to write Speaking of Courage, and how did you incorporate his mental issues into the chapter?
When I wrote the chapter, Speaking of Courage, I tried to capture the idea of Norman's mental issues by talking about him continuously circling the lake. This represented Norman's repeating thoughts and memories that haunted him. And Speaking of Courage, on page 138, I also wrote, "The muck was everywhere. You couldn't get away from it." This was Norman discussing the field and how it followed him outside the war. This was to symbolize Norman Bowker's mental issues, and it was to represent how he felt as if he could not escape those issues or illnesses.
One question I had about Speaking of Courage was your choice to write the text in third person limited. Why did you write in that point of view?
Well, the choice to write in third person limited was to show the readers just how secluded Norman was. He could only think to himself and not share his thoughts. He was closed to the world around him.
It seems that Norman Bowker is a character that can relate to many veterans of war, especially Vietnam veterans. I know that many of them have trouble adjusting after wars, but we are curious about what kind of mental illnesses affect veterans most often.
Hello, I'm Dr. Shrink. I'm a board-certified psychologist from Florida. I have worked with many patients before who are veterans and have done extensive research in this field. Thank you, Dr. Shrink. It's nice to have you on the show.
So, Dr. Shrink, what kind of diseases are most veterans faced with most often? And what are some more common examples of mental illness veterans face? And were any of the illnesses specific to the Vietnam War?
In research done by the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, approximately 10 to 18% of veterans that were in the Iraq and Afghanistan war are likely to come back with PTSD. What are some of the symptoms of PTSD? And do many people with PTSD have triggers that they have to try to avoid? Nightmares, flashback of a traumatic event. Triggers that cause these might be the news, car backfire, seeing an accident. You also may avoid situations that make you think about the event. What are some common treatments for people with PTSD? And what mental illnesses do you think Norman Bowker had? Typically, seeking assistance from a doctor or a psychologist is a great place to start. For many veterans, they are able to go to a VA facility and seek treatment. Typically, they go to a therapist or a psychiatrist, and they may be put on medication or see a professional weekly. Bowker most likely had PTSD. He avoided talking to people about it, a common symptom of PTSD. There was one specific event that triggered his bad thoughts. He also tends to distance himself from loved ones and people. All of these behaviors tend to point to it.
Thank you, Dr. Shrink. That is very helpful. And thanks for being on the show. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Book Podcast. Today's episode was about Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Tune in for our next episode sometime to hear about our next